Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Human Blockchain Explorers. Today, I have Dr. Jelani Clarke, core team member at DSi World, and he's going to take us through some of what decentralized science is, and building off of last week's episode with Joshua Bate, founder of DSi World. Jelani, thanks for being here.
Oh, this is a pleasure. I like how you guys frame it, the human exploration of blockchain. I think that's really important because sometimes when you get lost, I don't want to start out the gate being very like preachy or all this kind of stuff. But I think one massive component that tends to be lost sometimes, especially in the telemedical component or the telemedical space slash DSi space, is that human element and how important of value pillar that needs to be maintained for us to actually achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve, or that I hope most of us are trying to achieve in terms of bettering science and bringing science back to the people. So very like how you guys started that. But yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Very happy to talk more about DSi or whatever is on the table.
Yeah. Well, as you're probably familiar, Wolfram Research, we are a scientific organization building scientific research and tools to do deeper and deeper scientific work. So I'm sure some of my colleagues are very familiar with the troubles, the trials and tribulations of going through the scientific process and what that means inside of science. And you probably understand that a bit more than I do. Um, so um, I want to start with a quote that I heard you say, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but I think it really captured uh, a beautiful sentiment, but also like hinted at the things that are on the table for what decentralized science versus traditional science kind of looks like. So let me just go ahead and give this paraphrased quote back to you. Everyone begins in science for the love of it, excited to make change, contribute, share your gift. But unfortunately, what happens to the vast majority of eager scientists is that they start to realize that science is not done for the love of it and the sake of science itself. There's this undertone that is fueled by politics, prestige, ego, and money. And what you went on to talk about there, kind of you're weaving a very big and complicated topic, but I would like you to elaborate on some of the sentiments shared there and just really kind of bring us up to speed of what you experienced inside of your scientific career and where you're at now.
Right. So it's an interesting quote. And I've spent some time kind of rethinking it and thinking it, did I actually mean what I meant when I said that? And I think, yeah, there's definitely always nuance when it comes to these things. Not everybody's experience in any part of the world or in any, endeavor is the same. But I think overall, what I say there is true, for better or for worse. So what I mean to say there is, and I'll take the example of myself. I've always been very much interested in science. I'm one of those people who was lucky enough to very early on understand that this is the kind of path that I want to follow in life, and it opened, it oriented me, it vectored me into where I want to be. But you soon realize as you start to mature and become an adult, and this is the same in anything, this is actually part of adulting, is that what you want to do and what you can do, oftentimes there's discrepancies there, whether that be because the system, the infrastructure doesn't allow for that, or there's a little bit more, there's rules and regulations that prohibit you from that. That's kind of an aspect. And I think that's that's pervasive across um, all industries, all life endeavors. It's just kind of living. But what I really tried to hone in on there is that in the scientific community, or at least in the scientific discipline, there's a layer that extends beyond that in terms of the framework of what kind of science can and cannot be funded, And what that does in terms of creating a system where you're not able to express that creative freedom that you would think inherently, if you really go back to think about what science actually is, it's not there for that. To me, science and art, a scientist and an artist, are two sides of a similar coin. They're just using different tools or um, ideascapes to actually delve into that creativity. So whether I be asking a question in terms of what are the laws that govern this universe, what is the truths, what are the truths of this universe, versus portraying them, right, by painting them, it's the same thing. And I think contrary to art, there's a lack of mental freedom because you have to follow the money. Science is very expensive, prohibitively expensive for most at this point in the level of innovation that we've had going on. And that means that we need a lot of funding in terms of determining what we can and can't do. And obviously, those who control that funding control the narrative of what science can be put forward. And I think that's unfortunate because most of science is driven by passion. Most scientists, and I think in that conversation where that quote came from, I mentioned the fact that most scientists don't go into science to make money. Most scientists don't make that much money. It's not a prestigious thing for most participants. And it's, as a matter of fact, very, very hard on the ego. It's very, very hard on the mental scape. Science is failure. Science is essentially throwing yourself into the abyss, and hoping that you land on something, but it's rife with failure. And so you have to have a certain level of love and passion and dedication for that kind of work to actually even want to build a career in it. Um, and so it's unfortunate in a way, it's unfortunate that despite having all of that, because the system is architected in the way that it is, and this is not just one thing, it's an amalgamation of things, make it such that for the most part, scientists can't pursue what they're looking to pursue, at least in the totality of which they want to pursue it. So that's kind of the sentiment that fostered that statement or that perspective that I have in the world, and kind of why I want to change, or why I became involved in the open science movement and then the decentralized science movement.
Beautiful. I can see why you and Josh work well together. You both articulate this vast problem really well, and so I'm just kind of blown away by that just to begin with. So, well done there. Can you actually? I apologize, and give a chance for you to establish where you fit within the traditional science ecosystem. You have your doctorate in what, and what has your experience been going through traditional science, just to catch people up to speed and why they can kind of believe that you've seen it from the inside.
For sure, for sure. Should have started there actually. So I am a neuroimmunologist by training. For those of you who don't know, I studied the interaction between the immune system, so how you respond to outward information, bacteria, viruses, even internal damage, and that paradigm in the central nervous system, so your brain, and your spinal cord. Particularly when I did my PhD, when I was working on my PhD, I was working on multiple sclerosis, and understanding that immune component of predominantly, I guess the understanding is it's very genetic based, and there is some internal inherent component to it, and understanding the immune interactions there. But I digress. So I did my PhD in that. I then jumped from academia for a lot of the problems that I'm sure Josh has alluded to and we get to talk to. There's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of bureaucracy with there that limits, I think, the creativity and the career opportunity for scientists. And decided to go into industry because that's a little bit more permissive. There's a lot more opportunities there. However, so I worked at a biotech launchpad, that essentially is an entity that helps transition basic academic research into the commercial sphere. So if you're a scientist in an academic setting, and you find a target or you find something that you think could spin out a company or could be leveraged to become a therapeutic or what have you, we would come in, or you would come to us, and we would help transition you along. And so that gave me the first opportunities to view it from science from the business perspective and what goes into that aspect. Now, the majority of my work was on target validation, which is making sure the science was sound. But I also got to see some of that. And in that decision making, you start to run into these concepts that you realize that, people sitting at the top don't necessarily know all the science. It's not their job. They don't have to. But they end up making the decision on what is to pass and what is to be funded and what is a viable therapeutic. And you've quickly realized that though there's nothing inherently wrong there can be political and agenda driven or interest driven capture that can exist at that level that can either suppress or push forward science that may or may not or should not be pushed forward, right? There's this balance here. And so, I always knew about this. I think this is a tale as old as science in and of itself, in terms of, the divide between open science, open access, what should and shouldn't be, and what's being controlled. But it was my first time actually experiencing that firsthand, seeing that kind of thought process and realizing that there's danger here. The company that I worked on was not bad. They did a lot of great things and they pushed forward a lot of great therapies. It had nothing to do with that. But just as a concept, I think the overarching paradigm of profit over purpose has its benefit. It has its drawbacks, but it is the overarching monopoly of how we view science. And what I think needs to be done, and not just me, a variety of scientists out there, open science movement and the like, what we believe is there needs to be a complementary system that is purpose over profit. And those together can really highlight what I think science is supposed to be and drive the innovation that has stagnated over the last decade or so, if not more, because of this profit over purpose driven thought process or architecture of the industry.
Great.
And so
That's,
to digress, I've experienced both the academic and the industry. And I think that personally, where I am in my life, and behind me used to be a pin the tail on the donkey. I have a child, I have a daughter, 4-year-old daughter, almost 5. And at that time in my life, when I started this journey, I realized that I wanted to leave her a better place in this world. She's wants to be a scientist because Daddy is a scientist. And I would love it for her to come into her own as a scientist in a world that is much more, in one that supports scientists in various aspects, and just a better scientific industry, a better scientific culture. So that's really the crux of why I've come to be where I am.
I love that. And we want her to feel empowered to step into her full genius and bring her gifts to the world. We want to establish that for the entire world population. Can we enable and empower geniuses which exist everywhere, and not have it be stifled because we're only focused on one narrow we have a narrow focus, I guess you could say, now in both academia and in industry. And so your point of view, bringing that to light, is the first thing to expose it. So, what's the next thing? What was the, I don't know, aha moment or the original foray into crypto Web3 that kind of, ignited your interest in this space to have the ability to bring change, the things that you saw could be made different than what happened in the past?
Yeah, so I'll say my introduction, my initiation to Web3 kind of follows what I believe is the traditional trajectory. So started from a financial perspective, as a PhD student, you don't make that much money. And I was looking for, and I'm quite frugal. So I had amassed a certain amount. I had been able to allocate a certain amount of my stipend for saving purposes. And I wanted to get more than 0.05 return from just sticking in a bank account. And so that brought me to the crypto space by way of a friend, in terms of, okay, looking at these tokens, like, okay, there's some cool things they're pumping, they're dumping, what kind of trading opportunities might be there. And that eventually led me to understand that there was more here than just the financial component. There was a whole systems architecture that was developing. And at first, my first foray into this was decentralized finance, so DeFi, so yields and investment opportunities, and then being, curious as a scientist, going down the rabbit hole of, okay, but what is this actual tech? What is the fundamentals under this? So doing a lot of due diligence, not just by happenstance of being a curious participant, and understanding like, okay, there's like really neat things, not just from a tech perspective, but from an application perspective in terms of custody, self-ownership. And then NFTs come out. And then you have, okay, well, turning data into something more ephemeral than just what it is, but actual asset that you can leverage. And this started with JPEGs, and I never really got into NFTs, not to knock them. But this kind of thing kind of led me down the rabbit hole of understanding that Web3 is exactly what it touts itself to be on a whole, and it's ownership. It's being able to maintain sovereignty over what you create, over your intellectual property, and then means to leverage that. And so at some point the question kind of became, while I was having this existential query into, what kind of science do I want to be a part of? Where do I want to attribute my career path, my time, what's important to me? And the question kind of arose like, okay, well, how come I see it in finance, I see it in art, where is it in science? And so literally what I did is I sat down here at this table and I put in decentralized science. And then a DAO popped up, VitaDAO popped up, which I think has been the entry point for a lot of participants early on in the space. They're one of the more successful, the first and successful DAOs to spin up themselves in DSi. And then I just went down that rabbit hole, contributing, trying to learn more about the space and figuring out, there's all these different organizations. And then I stumbled onto Joshua. Serendipitously, he put out a call to action on Twitter in true Josh fashion, like, hey, I'm interested in building out a core team. Would anybody be interested? And at that time, I was looking to be more than, and this is a few months in, I was looking to be more than just a contributor. I wanted to help build out something. And so coming in on the ground floor was kind of where I wanted to be. And so I threw my hat in the ring. I think I messaged him immediately and I was like, hey, I'd love to, come in here and build out what DSi World was. And I'm sure Josh spoke about what DSi World as a concept is, but just to be brief, DSi World is looking to be that gateway that initiates people into what decentralized science can offer them as a value proposition, and also how to maneuver within the space. And sitting at such a high level of being that gate to help initiate people, I thought was very important, because half the battle is building the tech, yes, but the other half of that is how do you bring it to the masses, right? And I'm sure you can understand that as a podcast host. There's difficulties in that, and scientists are really bad with PR, and so being that layer or wanting to contribute at that level was where I thought there was a lot of value there, and one that was untapped. So that's how I kind of got into this space and have been working there ever since, and it's been a crazy ride. It has expanded my social network and my career network much further than I expected it to, which is really good from a career perspective. But also, and this is a slight off, but I've always wanted to be a teacher. And part of the reason of me leaving academia was just the difficulty of getting a lecturing only position. I didn't want to open my own lab because of the issues of funding and being a grant monkey and all this kind of stuff. But I always loved to teach. And when I transitioned to biotech, I kind of let that dream go. And I was like, maybe I'll revisit it at some time in the future if the opportunity presents itself. But I have that here now in decentralized science. And it merges with the capacity to do actual due diligence on scientific endeavors and scientific consulting. So it allows me to kind of have both, the best of both worlds. So I feel very blessed with where I am and building out this career.
That's awesome. I feel like anyone coming into the Web3 crypto space starts to ask some foundational questions like, if we can do money differently, or if what is money? And once you start to this is science playing itself out. You ask
Exactly.
those questions foundationally, and you then open up the world to question a lot of other things. And what I love about this space is that it really does give us a reset to understand the first principles of the systems that have been in existence for a long time, and to question what those things actually are and if they fit into the value systems that we believe in. And now here's the chance to bring our values and actually materialize them into some of the most powerful structures like networks and markets in the world, legal and contractual agreements in smart contracts. And so now it really is the scientific process manifesting. And so I imagine you're in several levels of meta science in having where you've seen and what this space is and what how it's playing out. So can you just speak about your experience? What is some serendipity? What is some what was like a great conversation that you've had in the past month with somebody that you didn't think you might have met before, if you were still in industry or in academia? Does anything come to mind?
So I think, and I've said this before, I think the most interesting, I don't know if this will directly answer your question, but to me, the most interesting conversations that I have as a scientist is with non scientists, because that clash, and it's not really a clash, but that, I guess, that integration of two different thinking processes, two different experiences, and two different ways of viewing the world gives birth to new ideas, novel ideas. And so to me, one of the things that I think is most interesting, and what I think really drives the value proposition in this space is that it opens, because Web3 and decentralized science, inherently the goal is to reduce the barrier of entry to participants, whether it be into science or finance, but since we're talking about science, is it allows people who have not necessarily been formally trained as scientists to come in and weigh in on scientific proceedings, whether it be drug discovery, humanities, medical data donation. You have this playing field where all these participants can come and clash and ideate together and, refute each other and have this open discussion. And that gives rise to a lot of wrong claims, but it also gives rise to a lot of really interesting ideas and vectors and avenues that previously, because these participants were so closed off or siloed from each other, you didn't have. And so whether it be talking about, okay, let's investigate the understanding of embryogenesis or the development of a human body in space with somebody who is both a space technician, a somebody who's a biologist or an embryologist, but also somebody who thinks about, neurochemistry and sociology and all these kind of things. And those might not all fit in that particular example, but that kind of interaction is very profound to me. So that's where the value proposition of DAOs come from to me in science, is you can assemble a bunch of participants that have maybe not have the same level of formal education, but have interest in different experiences. And it gives them a place to kind of sit down and talk about a particular topic. So whether it be longevity with VitaDAO or lifespan.io or whatever have you, or community engagement in terms of reaching scientists at DSi World's DAO, all these kind of things, to me, science is a contact sport. And people have heard me say this previously, it's contact sport. There, you need to have interaction with the participants. And so the more surface area you give for this kind of contact, the more amazing, innovative ideas are going to come out of it. And so it's hard for me to kind of sit down and think of like a particular one, because
Yeah,
sometimes they're subtle. Sometimes
yeah,
they're not like, oh, wow, this is a fantastic idea. Sometimes it's, oh, that was a cool idea. Like that was a really interesting conversation. Then it grows, it blossoms into something else by proxy of talking with other participants. And that's, I think, that subtle level of importance of value that exists there. It's not necessarily going to be the bam genius idea. It's going to be, oh, these inputs. And so to me, that's what it's been so far. And it's give rise to 77 so far on our dashboard, 77 DSi projects. That don't come from us, but people ideating on things. And I hope to see by the end of the year 100 more. There's a Cambrian explosion of ideas that are coming out of Web3, and I just hope that science
Yeah.
captures some of that potential and it takes off.
Yeah. The conversations with art and science together is really the powerful dynamic. So let me invoke the more skeptical and the kind of
Yes.
the darker side of what you might see. And could you go, let's just start here and just start to answer the questions around how do we actually do this? What's like, well, maybe fill me in. Where do you begin when you're like skeptical if this is going to work? What's that look like
This
for
as
you,
in the
for
industry, or
somebody
this
that
as in
does
a
see the
particular project?
inspiration and um well, because when I think of decentralized science, I think that you're a representative of the field,
Right.
but you're also a practitioner. But you're currently building the infrastructure to enable that field for more. And so, yeah, maybe what are the difficulties that you're seeing in the current participants, um, or just if when maybe you're having a conversation with your former colleagues and they say, what are you doing there? That's not science. That's I don't know, what are they
It's like
saying?
scientific
You know what I mean?
anarchy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay. So from a macro space perspective, I think that at least from my end, the limitation is always going to be that narrative. How do you convey um, interest or convey information in a way that people can understand what the potentials here are? I think it's difficult, especially when you're factoring in Web3. And I just want to make a disclaimer here: decentralized science is not strictly dependent on Web3. It is a big part of it right now because I think the participants that the incumbents spun out of that. But DSi extends beyond Web3. As a matter of fact, we have some organizations that don't even implement blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology in their frameworks. That's just one thing. But with that in mind, there's a narrative, there's an uphill narrative battle of like, okay, blockchain. As soon as you say this, people start to think scam, or most people think like, it's financials, or it's it's fake stuff. And so scientists even more so, to an extent, because scientists the paradox here is scientists are trained to question and be skeptical of everything, but on another hand, we're extremely dogmatic when it comes to paradigms and the shifting of paradigms. And so when you introduce things like, hey, there's this whole new alternative funding route that you can have that'll help facilitate you getting your, scientific endeavor or what have you, there's always inherent skepticism because it deviates from what they currently understand, and they're very much more resistant. So that's a little bit difficult, and that's kind of where DSi World kind of sits itself squarely in terms of trying to bust through those limitations. And I think we are going to start having more and more success as more actual tooling comes online, that scientists can actually use. DSi is transitioning itself from a dream and a theory to actual tech that people can very same day today spin up and leverage in their science. And I think that's going to be really important. So that's one thing. From a smaller perspective, from an individual organization perspective, there's always qualms because there's limitations or there's quandaries. So for example, if you can open the funding landscape for anybody to come in and fund science, well, what kind of science are you funding? and what are their checks and balances and rail guards that are going to be hopefully put in place to stop non-ethical or low ethical science from proceeding. In addition to that, how do you do that across jurisdictions, national jurisdictions? Because I can be from country A who may have issues with country B and contribute to a scientist from country B and vice versa. And so what does that mean from the government perspective? What does that mean from your own internal liabilities? And then when you start to also factor in layers of like ownership, if I contribute, there's a certain subsection of DSi that is leveraging these things called IP NFTs. And they're a great framework, a really interesting framework. But how do you factor in liabilities of the DAO participants if something were to go wrong with that IP? If it was to ever damage and harm somebody and then they get sued, well, you're part owner and you funded it. How does that work? So there are a lot of quandaries when it comes to, opening up the playing field that is science, legally, liability wise, morally, ethically. And those are things that are we constantly talk about, or we try to talk about as a platform for communication and science communication, in terms of speaking to both retail, like be careful when you get involved with these projects, make sure you understand the ins and outs, and also do your due diligence. Are they presenting you with these drawbacks? That's really important. And on the other side, telling organizations like, hey, you need to be very transparent. Like, I know you want to get up off the ground and all that kind of stuff, but you need to be very transparent with your limitations as well as the benefits that you can provide to whatever industry you're trying to tackle. And that's just an ongoing conversation that we have, and part of like when we consult with people.
Fascinating. Just as a logistical side note, I'm getting a little bit of lag between your audio and your visual. I can hear you perfectly fine. So I'm just, I don't know if you feel it from me or see it from me.
No, I can see it from me though.
Okay. All right. All good. Conversation is still going awesome. Forward. All right. So that's fascinating. And while you were speaking, it kind of made me think of, on one hand, the benefits of connecting chemists, biologists, and neuroimmunologists, and physicists, and all of these different folks, right? Right. But not everybody's speaking the same language, even though we're scientists, right? So from that level, if we're just assuming that they're excellent scientists that are deeply specialized and do know basic science from across the field, if we get them all into the room together, still having a conversation where everybody's on the same page to move science forward is difficult. Yes. But let's leave that there. If we go to the opposite end and we open up the conversation to a lot more voices, and everyone has an opinion, things get noisier, much noisier. And so reputation feels like a double-edged sword here, because on one hand, I need to know, because I need to trust you so that we can move this conversation forward, and I do understand that you have a specialization here. On the other hand, it leads to power dynamics where you become entrenched and are trusted too much, and maybe we see that more in our organizations than we see at personal levels. If you're following me, where does reputation in this play out, and is this like a super important part to you? I know that Josh and I established that it was a very difficult technical thing to accomplish. We all know, and our reputations precede us in a lot of different ways, and so we intuitively have it, but digitally, blockchain points to us owning part of our reputation, but it's still something that's developed by a whole group. I'm trying to wrap my hands around reputation. Where do you fall in that in this whole conversation?
Right. Um, so reputation, for those of you who don't know, reputation is the currency of science in its current iteration, its current paradigm. Um, you get access to funding, you get prestigious nominations, all based off of your reputation. And that's good, and that's fine. The problem comes with when the reputation level starts to dissociate itself from the actual science.
Mm.
And that can sometimes happen, or that tends to happen when you can no longer, well, when, if you can no longer, so let me step back. A major issue in science is the replication crisis, right? The fact that most science, like 80% or more of science at a given time, is not able to be repeated when retested. Now, that should call into question the reputation of the participants who do that science, right? But the vast majority of people don't know that. And reputation, as you mentioned, precedes the individual, right? They'll get, you know,
Mm.
merits, they'll get attestation based off of their name and not so much the science that they're doing. That's not fully true, but there's a component to that. Reputation has started to
And then
supersede the actual value creation of science or the meritocracy of science.
and
What
then that's
DSi is
where
hoping to do, I'm sorry, go ahead.
money and attention and that type of thing flows. Go ahead. I didn't
Exactly.
mean to cut you off.
No, no, fine. It's exactly that, right? And then that starts to bastardize the system. And it essentially is Goodhart's law, right? When the measure becomes the target, then it no longer
Mm.
stands as a good measure. So reputation and publication and all these kind of things became was used to be a representation of quality of science, but it then became the target of science. And so just publish, 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 even if the science is squirrely, and so much so that the emphasis became on publishing that it incentivizes the science to become squirrely. And that's the issue. So what Web3 and blockchain does indirectly is it provides, to a certain extent, data provenance. So it allows you to query and check that, with digital data, and eventually it'll come to more physical, tangible data as we start to have blockchain integrated or distributed ledger technology integrated hardware. But from a macroscopic perspective, the data provenance, the ability to not have to trust this person's reputation, but actually be able to go back and verify it, either running the code because the way that they've published or the tools that they've published incorporate all, metadata and all these kind of the or the comprehensive data units. You no longer have to do that. So I don't have to trust that you may have a Harvard degree, and that's really good in terms of like the face on. But I can go back and check and make sure that, okay, you have a steady track record of data that builds from itself. And also people have verified it. And so when you have something like a DAO or a group, a collective of participants that have different degrees, different skill sets, well, people can talk, and yeah, there's definitely a lot more noise. But when it comes to actually doing something or chiming in, well, now you have a playing field that I can verify. I can see if you're talking nonsense. If I can debate you, if I can have these open conversations and you're able to logically coordinate your decision making or logically coordinate your argument instead of just saying, well, I'm X scientist or X scientist said this and therefore we must believe it, right? And that's going into another whole kettle of fish. But those kind of things, that level of meritocracy is important. And so for me, and I think the vast majority of builders in this space that come from that particular angle, blockchain allows for a more meritocratic system because it takes away some of that trust, that need for trust. The trustlessness nature of data acquisition and data logging and data compilation brings forth more trust. And so that's where I kind of see that sitting. Now, as it relates to the different, to your original point of like different people speaking different languages, I think that is actually something that is in and of itself very, very important. Um, among scientists, we're often used to it because science is interdisciplinary. But that layer that exists between formal scientists and what we call laymen's, that divide has extended itself over the last 20, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I think that there needs to be a returning to maybe not parity, but closer. Science needs to be not abstracted away. People need to understand what is powering their utilities, what is powering their food choices, where the food comes from, how drugs are developed, all these kind of things. It's really important for a variety of reasons, as I think we've come to see. Just trusting people willy nilly based off of who their name is isn't sufficient. It's not enough. And it sometimes leads to poor decision making. It sometimes leads to really great decision making, but you shouldn't want to understand. Maybe this is just me as a scientist, as like a purist. I want to understand what I'm getting myself into. I want to be able to have discussions. And I think there's just value there. There's value being able to debate and have open discussions.
Absolutely. So, how do you see yourself affecting DSi and traditional science in the work you're doing now? What's this? And this is kind of like Josh also suggested that I ask this because I think he appreciates your perspective from a different point of view. So, like, what do you do as a core team member at DSi?
For sure. So I wear a few hats, and DSi World is early enough whereby we're a core team of 5. We kind of wear interchanging hats. So my responsibilities include hosting a variety of our media content, so Twitter Spaces, podcasts, doing outreach to traditional scientific organizations in terms of bringing them on, doing outreach internal to the space, so finding projects and liaising with them. I also do some of the scientific advising, whether it comes to projects that exist in Web 2 that want to come into Web 3 or build out a Web 2.5 framework that incorporates blockchain, and they just kind of have a lay of the land. Oftentimes, I'll be dealing with these participants, so I'm doing a lot more dev, business to business relations and all that kind of stuff. But even within that, there's also scientific components. So validating, scientific theory, seeing if, to the best of my ability, I'm not proficient in everything. But I have a network of formal scientists that I can always pull on in terms of all this kind of stuff. So I do consulting, I do business development, I do PR, I do relations, and one of the 3 faces that represent, I think, what DSi World is building. And I think that's really important, not to like commandeer the conversation, but the DSi World platform core team is very representative, or it's very heterogeneous. We are 50% women. We are spread across the world of different ethnicities. I think we represent most of the major ethnicities as a team. And I think that's really important when it comes to representing what DSi as a whole could be, and the limitations present for either underrepresented participants of various form and formats in science. And so being able to see somebody who looks like me, somebody who looks like Carolina, who is from Uruguay, somebody who looks like Josh, who is from the UK, or Talisa, who is in the United States, is of Asian heritage, and all these kind of things. I think that's important as an underlying message. Like, DSi is here for everybody, and it's really the playing ground. It's the playground that we can all use to kind of correct certain inequalities, imbalances that exist in the scientific industry for a variety of reasons. Sometimes not intentional, but I think there's a point in understanding there.
Yeah, and I gave a shout out in the conversation with Josh, but your conversation with Miss Purple, I believe her name is Rue, on Bankless Africa, was an incredible conversation, and I just wanted to make sure that people are aware of it and should check out their podcast. And we can highlight with the positions you find yourself in, we can highlight others doing really great work, and perhaps that's enough to start shifting eyeballs and attention, and then potentially, um, does it all devolve to funding? Does
No,
science have to devolve to? Okay. Do you
no.
feel any? Do you feel strongly that way, and why?
I, I do feel strongly to the fact that it doesn't always have to devolve to funding. I think as we move forward, currently DSi is captured in a very funding focused PR narrative. Um, and I think that's a little bit unfortunate because there's more to offer there, whether it be, as I mentioned, the open playing ground or the tool sets that are not revenue incentivized but provide data provenance, so the utility for scientists. There's three main pillars there, or three major pillars that I think exist in DSi, and just finance is getting the highlight of it, but I don't think it is the most important. It may be the most impactful because everybody needs to have money to do things. Money is the ultimate driver of initiatives. But I don't think that beyond that, I don't think it's the most important. And I hope that people start to value the non-monetary value or value proposition that DSi brings. And honorary shout out to I love all DSi projects. Okay. But one of the most interesting toolings that I'm excited about as a scientist is coming out of DSi Labs, which is not DSi World. It's its own entity. They've developed DSi nodes, and this is a tool that allows you to incorporate metadata of a variety of kinds, going back to what I was talking about, into one unit of knowledge. So think about PDF on steroids, where the PDF itself becomes a living organism that you can iterate on trackably because it's on blockchain. You can see all the changes, but you can add in. So if I publish an article, which is a painful process, but if you publish an article and the next week or the next month you find a new piece of data and you're like, that would fit in that article. Now, traditionally, you have to wait to amass a body and then republish, give or take a few things. With DSi nodes is you can incrementally add that in,
Mm.
and it makes it living. I can put in this kind of conversation explaining, if I go to a conference, explaining the data itself. And so it addresses so many things that we talked about in terms of changing the abstraction divide, because you can have accompanying material, data provenance, because I know where the data is coming from and I can track it back to its source. And then anything that references that is also incorporated into the process. So you have a historical chain when it comes to that data, going as far as it needs to go and is back to the original statement. So there's a lot of power there from a scientific perspective that I think people outside of science don't really understand because that's not part of their framework. But that, to me, is what's really going to drive scientific adoption, even more so than the opportunity for alternative funding, because that comes with its own issues of securities and financial regulation and all these kind of caps. There's much more utility there for the scientists themselves outside of the funding.
Mm. So it's an education. It's a mind shift. It's
Exactly.
bottom up and top down ways of kind of spreading the message. It's some stability. There needs to be some stability to know that this is a place where you can outlet to, and we need leadership and examples by which you are demonstrating that there are alternative ways of doing this, and it can be just as um, sustainable, but even more rewarding, because now
Exactly.
is 50% of my time spent, pandering to receive money, or is that 100% of the time or 95% of the time now spent doing the work that I feel gifted that I'm capable of doing?
Exactly.
And we start to flip that mindset, and there will be critical mass at some point that yeah, I see it. So um all right, I have four topics sitting in front of me. Each one's going to open up a little bit of more of a rabbit hole. So I'm not sure I want to touch on every one of them. And before I do that, I want to just kind of ask to see if there's anything in particular that we haven't talked about yet that, from your point of view, is worth talking about, just to make sure that I'm not driving the conversation in one direction. That's we still need to air something out. I don't know if there's something for
No,
you know.
and if you want to touch on all four pillars, I'll try to I will keep my responses brief. I think one thing that I do want to emphasize, and this kind of pulls from the Bankless Africa perspective, is I think one of the most valuable value propositions, or the most important value propositions that decentralized science and Web3 brings, is not is opening up the landscape to participants that have previously been not only underrepresented but excluded. So whether that be Latin America, India, Africa, and not as a whole, but there are significant areas and pocket populations in these places that don't have access to science in the same way as North America and some of the more higher income countries have. And I think that value proposition
So
is amazing.
so what do you mean by that? Do let's just take India for example. It's a huge population. There is there is school and university, right? There, so there is science still,
Yeah,
uh, right? And what is not accessible there?
right. So there, and this is why I said pocket populations within this thing, because it's not to say that there's no scientific industry there. But what I will say is that there is many more barriers that it takes to get into, you know, particular areas. So if I come from, so for example, I'll give an example here. So it relates to India. So my family's from Barbados. And there's not as much of a scientific industry as it exists here in Barbados, right? But there are just as many gifted participants, probably by percentage, in any given population. But because of their either socioeconomic issues, opportunity issues, geographic limitations, they may not have access to the body of literature or the body of whatever have you need to get access to that science. And so to me, what I mean by this is being able to join a DAO, spin up your phone and join a group of participants that have
Mm,
skill sets, are willing to share those skill sets and teach you, or you get access to, and you can actually flex that genius, that inherent aspects of yourselves that because of whatever limitations you couldn't. That's what I mean. So there's a lot of untapped brain potential that exists across this world that is untapped for a variety of reasons. And I think DSi and Web3 is the process of tapping into those kind of things in a way that is atypical from what it needs to be. Again, you don't need to have a PhD in neuroimmunology to be able to contribute to the record of knowledge that is science. You really don't. And a lot of scientists are really stupid, right? Like it's just that's what it is. There's a lot of people who are super smart that don't have these designations. And I think it's unfortunate. It's missed opportunity. It's like a gold mine that you know is there, but you can't tap into. And that's what I
abs-
mean by in terms of being access.
Absolutely. Um, I would go even further in saying at some level, humans, I think in general, we might be convinced that um, we aren't the genius that exists within us, and that um, that we need to go through a certain step through the ladders of society to prove that I am capable to others and to myself before I can believe that I am capable of contributing. And so here's 7 years of uh, costly and status driven ladder jumping to then get you to a place where you feel like you're confident that you can really start to produce and contribute. But then at that point, uh, you know, maybe you're indebted or you're just a little bit behind, and you have to enter into the next realm of here's industry and here's that step ladder, and then at some point,
Can we,
so
can we skip some of these rat races? And I equate it to open
yes,
source software. The advent of open source software, apps, people being able to spin up apps, that is what I provide as a similar or a
Yeah.
simile to what I hope it brings to the scientific realm as a whole is that being able to do DIY science or contribute where you are to help support where you're from without having to leave it. And that opens up a whole other can of fish. But yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Great. All right. So we're gonna try and do these.
Quick.
I've now made it three topics. I've removed one
Okay.
just because I can't necessarily frame the question in the way that I think I might want. So here's one. Well, here are the three. One is called Weather DAO. Another one is on AI, and the last one is A Beautiful Life. The Beautiful Life will close us out. So let me start with Weather DAO. Um, Internally here at Wolfram Blockchain Labs, we've been discussing how to bring the enormous set of facts and algorithms that Wolfram has in a computational format to the world, so that we can enable more nuanced types of potentially um, to help farmers. Let's say we want to help farmers. So we need to make sure that farmers feel protected if there is an extreme weather event, and that's leads to something called parametric insurance. It's parameter based, and so uh, how do you how do we this team of researchers and scientists and builders, we don't necessarily see in the we see a road to economic sustainability, but jumpstarting that a little bit on research and other things. How would you recommend we could use DSi World or the DSi space to start to really help accelerate our thinking there?
So I guess it depends on what angle you want to attach it. So is it if it's from the angle, for example, of more data coming on and more diverse data representative of different places on the world, which enriches the data set, then you can leverage, you can tap into, frameworks like decentralized MRV measuring validation tools that are being built. And a perfect example of this is ClimeCheck and a variety of other climate focused platforms that are developing these decentralized tooling and funding platforms to incentivize local communities to leverage these things. If you can, if for people who are part of DeFi, you can think about it like the HNT. Anyways, I'm not going to go into that, but that's the tooling that you
Helium.
can leverage. Yeah, exactly. Helium. There you go. You
Yeah.
can think of it like Helium, right? Where you have your node and you can all run that kind of stuff. So people are leveraging those kind of thought processes and incentivizing farmers and local regions to do that. On the other side, via DSi World, the value proposition there is the communication. So we, by proxy of being who we are, become a node in a network of that is DSi. So information flows through us, and we help to guide it to particular entities that need it. So whether it be us coming to government bodies and saying, "Hey, listen, there's this packet of information here that you can leverage, either from Wolfram or decentralized communities, whether it be DAOs or science, climate, or regenerative agriculture." Our goal is to help
Yeah.
stitch together these different populations that normally don't speak to each other in the same way, and hopefully provide it in a way that is digestible for them to take it in. So we want to be that kind of input output gateway, where that's what we're trying to strive really hard to be. And so for something like that, like a weather DAO, there are a variety of participants that want access to that data and just are either not aware of it, and don't know how to utilize it. And so we'll pull together the disparate threads of this community is really good at analyzing, this community is really good at disseminating, and let's hook these up together and see what we can push out.
Yeah. I just finished a book. It's titled Sacred Economics, but the main point of it was um, true value lies in community, and because at the end of the day, I always think about the billionaire and the pauper on a ship sinking in the ocean, and the pauper has the life vest, and the billionaire has billions of dollars, but at no price the pauper give the life vest. And so, all right, so the very small example, but uh, when it when boiled down, true value lies in community. And what I think you're also saying is that we're attracting people who are interested in science and in empowering other scientists. And so if you come here, you're going to be finding the types of people that you do want to connect with at the end of the day to move
Exactly.
this type of stuff forward.
Exactly. Exactly. This exact same value proposition of a DAO and the opportunity to present
Mm,
stuff by developing a tribe, a community that is all shares the same goal. May attack it in different ways, which is great, but shares a goal. So you have less friction when you come to this space.
all right. The next one is AI, and huge topic. Okay, so what do I mean? When you were talking about people having different languages, and it's what is how do we get people to align themselves so that we are speaking the same conversation? It made me think that AI assisted language digestion or AI assisted code generation, so that what's being spoken across the aisle is in some way more attuned to who they are to be ingested, rethought, and sent back across the aisle. Do you have any strong opinions on AI and kind of things coming out recently for how that affects life?
Yeah, I think AI is a fantastic tool and it's addresses what you kind of spoke about in terms of being able to translate to a certain extent context when it comes to information and being kind of like that sci-fi universal translator where I don't have to speak X language. I can speak and it'll translate for me. The one caveat there is that I think there's always a human component where people can say a same sequence of words, but view it infinitely differently, even though it's
Yeah.
the same thing. That AI can't account for that, but it brings us closer.
Mm.
The one thing that I will say about AI, and I'm not an AI specialist, but as it relates to decentralized science and owning one's own data, we need to be careful with how we interact with AI because these are centralized AIs. And so the data acquisition that it's generating, unbeknownst to certain people if they don't think about it, all of your inputs and outputs are being measured, are being captured. And so if you, for example, go to OpenAI and you write out a business model, well, now AI has your business model. And OpenAI could turn around and leverage that. The advent of decentralized AIs, and I know a few participants that are working very hard for that, and it's much more difficult, right? It's much more complex. But I think if we can get to that point where we have decentralized AIs that are at parity with the ability and the value proposition that that centralized AIs have, then we'll be a lot less concerned. But there's pros and cons there, and I very, very much suggest people to check out the Foresight Institute. Um, they work on a lot of esoteric science and like fringe science, and they're very hard proponents in terms of ethics in AI and computation. So very good people to check into if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
All right. Sweet. So, last thing here, let me paint you a little picture and then you tell me what you see. Um, this the science that you've spoken about today, the potential, has been solved, and it exists, and people freely and uh, freely collaborate and are doing it on a global level where we see people contributing from all walks of life everywhere in the world. What do you see Jelani doing at that point? Is he sitting on a beach, relaxing, knowing that the mission was accomplished? Is he raising the next generation of that scientist? And what do you see yourself doing? And um, what do you see? Where do you see yourself in that image?
That's a really good question, and that's something that I ask myself relatively frequently. Um, I would like to say that I would ideally want to be at least an entity in this space that does help in terms of shepherding participants into this world. Um, Being here as yourself, as many of the incumbents that exist now at the ground level, I think gives us insight or better insight or unique insight into the trajectory and being part of most stages as it progresses. I think that's important in terms of making sure that there's no deviation or there's less deviation from the original idea. Things get kind of like broken telephone, things get corrupted over time, not necessarily in a bad way, but it gets shifted. And so, you'll definitely catch me on a beach somewhere because Barbados is my home and I love being there.
Right.
But I would probably get back into basic research, honestly, leveraging decentralized opportunities of alternative funding and not having to be pigeonholed. I would be balancing research with teaching, and I'll divulge a guilty perspective that I had when I started to craft my theory of like why I would want to build a framework or build a career in DSi so early. And I think part of it, or not, I don't think part of it was being able to amass that level of experience and knowledge, whereby, hey, if I do want to go teach, and there will be DSi, relevant curriculum that are going to be developed at university. Well, I can come and say like, hey, listen, meritocratically, I was a part of hopefully ushering this in, and so there's
Mm-hmm.
validity there. So that's a little bit of the selfish perspective in what I do. But I'd love to teach. I really truly love to teach, and actually being in the space has allowed me to really understand how much I love the interpersonal relations and interactions that exist. And I hope we don't lose that in this digital age. But that's kind of where I want to build a career in. So whatever form that takes, I'm not sure, but I'm not one really to sit back. I like to do stuff, so I'll always be doing something.
You have a knack for it. I learned a lot during our conversation. You know how to really explain things well and inspire me. So I can see it. I can see you on that beach giving the lecture, or bringing a contingent of people with you to be in person and doing the next levels of science and scientific teaching. So uh, let's uh, let's call it there, Jelani. I really appreciate your time and this conversation today, and I would like to touch base with you in the future when it makes sense to have another conversation.
Absolutely. I thank you for that. I appreciate the kind words, and yeah, and this goes to anybody. If you're open, if you're interested in learning more about decentralized science and to help shaping it, you want to contribute. My DMs on Twitter are open. My LinkedIn is always accessible. I think consider myself a friendly enough, approachable person. So please don't feel shy to come up and talk. I love to talk about stuff. I love to debate. So my door is always open.
Awesome. Once again, thank you, and talk to you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph.